Greetings, everyone, both here in person and there on Zoom. Thank you for attending. This is the final lecture of the spring 2022 lecture series for SoMAS in Southampton. Oh yeah, I'm Chris Gobler, Director of Academic Programs for SoMAS in Southampton. And it's my pleasure tonight to be introducing Kevin Reed, Professor at SoMAS, for giving a lecture tonight. Kevin happens to be the Associate Dean for Research at SoMAS. And in that capacity, he's leading all sorts of important initiatives, including one to potentially have Stony Brook run a climate change center on Governor's Island in New York City. And we're very excited about that. But tonight, he's going to talk to us about climate change. Brief background on Kevin, if I can remember it all properly. He did his undergraduate and graduate work at the University of Michigan, undergraduate degree in physics and a PhD in atmospheric and space sciences. Did an internship at the US Senate, doing some policy work for a year before he went to National Climate Center in Boulder, Colorado, where he did a postdoc before Stony Brook was lucky enough to recruit him and bring him here. And he's done great things and is going to tell us about exciting climate change research getting done in his lab here in New York. So Kevin, awesome. Take it away. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Chris. Okay, let me get started. Let me get situated. Cool. Yeah, so I'm going to talk a little bit about, well, first I'm going to give an overview of climate change and how we know that it's happening, as well as a little bit of definition of what I mean when I talk about weather, at least for this presentation. And then I'll talk a little bit about two projects that my group is involved in trying to understand how weather is going to impact the East Coast and Long Island in the future. But first, I like to always start with a quick motivation for why I do the work that I do and why I think the science that we're working on in SoMAS is important. And in particular, it's my viewpoint that we're kind of entering an era where the numerical tools, so the computational tools that we typically use to assess long-term climate change historically, are actually approaching those that we now use for short-term weather prediction. And I'll explain a little bit more what that means, but it means that the same models that we use for your favorite weather app to see what the weather is going to be like this weekend are not that much different than the atmospheric component of the climate models that we run to project changes of climate into the future. And as such, then these type of climate modeling tools are actually improving our ability to investigate trends in extreme weather, which have a particular impact on society, but also to project regional impacts of climate change, which is important for planning and adaptation purposes. And together, and I hope to provide a little bit of evidence in this talk, is that it's providing applications to actually really work across disciplines as well as with local communities to try to actually develop climate solutions. But first, it's always good to think about where we live. So I'm going to start with an extremely high level. And so the high level right at first is that we live on Earth. And it's important to realize that our understanding of the Earth as a system, as an interconnected system made up of ocean and lands and the atmosphere and the connection between all of them is actually a relatively new field. And our appreciation for how complex the Earth system is didn't really come about until we started to go to space. And one of the first things we did when we went to space is we turned the camera around and looked back at Earth. And so these two images are probably some of the most famous images ever taken. Particularly you have Earthrise, right, which is the first actual image in color of Earth. And you have the blue marble, which is actually the first full disk picture ever of Earth from outer space. And so, well, not from outer space, just in general, right? And the fact is, if you look at those dates, the dates are important. That wasn't that long ago. And so this shows you that all the research and understanding that we have of environmental and climate issues are relatively new and have been really a great example of how research and development and connections from academia to industry to the government can actually really help to spread our knowledge of new topics. But we also when we live on Earth, we engage mostly in our day-to-day lives right here in the atmosphere, which happens to be that very, very thin envelope that goes around the Earth. And it's really just this very thin layer that's maybe 10, 20 miles thick, depending upon how you want to define it, that actually protects us here on Earth from the harsh environment of space. And so what's going on in that really thin layer is really important for understanding how the climate is changing and what we're doing to it. But of course, if we just zoom in right on where we specifically live, which is on a part of Earth on Long Island, right, that you can see that just looking at a satellite image of Long Island, that there is a range of land surface type, right? You have the urban environment all the way out near New York City, which goes out to kind of more farmland. You have the impact of rivers, the open ocean, as well as the sound. And so when we start to try to understand local impacts of climate change, we have to keep in mind that we have to really think about all of the connections between these systems that are even more complex when you think about it at the local level, which presents a challenge. So first, I want to take maybe 10 minutes or so just to talk a little bit of setting the stage for what climate change is and how we understand and measure and study the climate. And then I'll talk a little bit about extreme weather and then how we at Stony Brook and in my group in School of Marine Atmospheric Sciences is focusing on blending these two topics to try to understand how weather changes. So the first is that the fundamentals of climate is really based upon a strong foundation of our understanding of the Earth's climate that comes from the fundamental principles that actually conserve most things in science. So the conservation of energy, momentum, and mass are at the principle of what we understand about our Earth's climate. And these are foundations that are deeply rooted in physics. As well as our understanding of Earth's climate is really based on an enormous and diverse number of observations that have been collected not only of the last 50 years since we started taking some of those pictures that we showed at the beginning, but actually going further back in time, in some cases millions of years, by collecting data by various sources. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. And so just at first order, well, what do I mean when I say that our understanding of climate is governed by the conservation of things like energy, mass, and momentum? Well, the first is to think is that we actually understand the Earth's energy budget quite well. And the fact is that similar to a bathtub, right? If you fill up a bathtub, but you have the drain, the Earth has the same thing in which typically the amount of water, or sorry, in this case, the amount of radiation energy that comes from the sun equals the amount of outgoing energy from the Earth system itself. And so the way to think about this is if you want the temperature of the Earth to stay the same, you have to have that balance there. And you could do the same thing in a sink or a bathtub, right? Is that if you have the faucet turned on and the same amount of water is coming into the bathtub that is leaving through the drain, the level of the bathtub will remain the same. And so in an equilibrium climate, you actually have this balance that occurs, and that's a fundamental understanding of the Earth system. Now, however, how that balance is achieved is very complex. As you saw from those images of the Earth from space, the Earth's surface alone is very complex between different types of land and the ocean, but also the atmosphere itself has things like clouds and aerosols and pollution and all these different things which impacts the flow of energy through the system. And it's really trying to understand how that energy flows through the system in which we can try to understand the basics of climate. I'm not going to get into that, so I just wanted to focus on this. I want to focus on one of the aspects that controls how much energy can come into the Earth system from the sun as well leave. And that really comes through the composition, what the atmosphere is made of. And so we know that the atmosphere is majority made of nitrogen and oxygen. Almost 99% of the atmosphere comes from those two gases. And of course, it's great that oxygen is a big part of it because that's why we're able to exist as humans on Earth. But what's interesting is some of the aspects that are most important for understanding the energy balance of the Earth system comes to what we call trace gases. These are gases that make up a very, very small amount of the atmosphere, but are very active radiatively in that energy balance with the sun and in the system. And so the most particularly important one is actually carbon dioxide. And carbon dioxide is important because it's a greenhouse gas, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second of what that means. But it's also important because it's a driver of the climate change that we've experienced over the last 100+ years. And it's been a driver of climate change actually on the scales of millions of years that's occurred in the past. And it's just worth noting that it's currently about 418 parts per million. And so I just wanted to reference that in part because, well, parts per million, that's not even percentage, right? So that means if you had something that was, so parts per million means it's a very, very small fraction of 1%. It's a small fraction of 0.1%. So it's a very small component of the atmosphere, but it's particularly important when we talk about that energy balance. And one of the key things to note is that if since we've been able to observe carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and that's worth mentioning as well, we've only been able to actually measure carbon dioxide in the atmosphere going back to the late 1950s. And that's because it represents such a small fraction of the atmosphere that it's actually very, very hard to measure. But due to advances and some technological advances, we've been actually measuring the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere since about 1958. And as you can see from this plot, that over this time frame, that the amount of carbon dioxide has steadily gone up, and actually is starting to accelerate them a little bit faster as how much it's going up. Now, of course, there's some interesting aspects about this plot, which we're not going to go into. There's wiggles up and down, right? That's an annual cycle due to the fact that there's differences between growth season in the northern and southern hemisphere. But what's important to note is the general trend of the carbon dioxide is going up and has been going up since the 1950s, since we started measuring it. But also, if you look back at the global temperature record, and this is just a measure of right now of the global average surface temperature, but it's taken as a difference from the average. But you'll notice that in general, if you were to look at a line here, that the temperature on Earth has also been going up for over 100 years. Of course, there's natural wiggles up and down. Some years are warmer than others. And that's understood because of variations in the climate system, such as things like El Nino and La Nina. But it's also shown that it's been going up. Now, I want to just acknowledge that it's not, climate scientists didn't just take two plots like this and say they're both going up, so the carbon dioxide must be causing the warming. We'll talk a little bit about how we know the connection between those two in a second. But first, I just want to show a quick video of what it looks like when what this warming looks like, because this plot I showed on the last is just a global average temperature, so it's one number, but it's worth noting that as the Earth warms, it warms differently in different regions for different reasons at different times of the year. And so if you just focus over this evolution over the last 100 years, you'll see that there is a lot of structure in what that warming looks like. And so you'll notice that as it warms, certain parts warm faster than others, particularly if you look at the Arctic region right near the North Pole, that's warming substantially faster than other parts of the globe on average. And then by the end, you'll also notice that also the land masses start to stand out. So that suggests that the warming is actually larger over land than it is over the open ocean areas. This always gets me of how to, there we go. And if we look at reports that come out from the United States government every 4 years called the National Climate Assessment, we can also see that we've seen a change at the local level in the United States. And so over the last 100+ years, we've seen a substantial warming almost everywhere in the continental United States. And that warming is also associated with changes in our environment, such as changes in the amount of rainfall we observe. So if you focus on the Northeast area where we live, you'll see that there's actually been, in some places, upwards of a 15% increase. So that's kind of in the green areas, in the average rainfall every year in areas like the Northeast and Long Island is about 5 to 10% over the last 100+ years. And so, so this warming comes with implications. It's not just that it's a little bit warmer each day outside. It's also that our weather is actually changing, and we'll get a little bit more into that as we go on. But first, I want to step back and say, well, why are we interested in carbon dioxide? Well, it actually goes back for some long. So even though the area of Earth science is relatively a new field, as I started with, scientists have actually understood through experiments, actually, in the lab, that carbon dioxide has a warming potential, that it's a greenhouse gas. And we've actually known this for well over 150 years, well before we even knew that the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was increasing. And so because of this warming potential it has, we refer to it as a greenhouse gas. And where does it come from? Well, if we look actually real quick to note that it's not just carbon dioxide. I focus on carbon dioxide here, but there's actually other greenhouse gases that have also been increasing over this period of time, such as methane, which is actually, this plot here is a little outdated. If we were to show this for recently, it's actually methane's been increasing substantially in the last 5 years or so. And there's other gases such as N2O, which are also increasing. They all have a warming potential. And I'll talk one more in a second about that. And if you look at where is this emissions of carbon dioxide coming from, if you look and you do accounting, which is what the US government does every year for 2020, about 25% of the carbon dioxide emissions in the United States came from electricity generation. About another 27, so another quarter, came from our transportation systems. So right, the exhaust out of our automobiles. About another quarter comes from industry. So from manufacturing and making things. And then there's a split of the last kind of quarter that comes from agriculture, as well as residential and commercial buildings. So heating and cooling of our buildings themselves. And just to acknowledge that this is one data set I showed you here, but this is also true for a variety of other data sets that if you look at changes that we've seen in things like just land air temperature or sea surface temperature or marine air temperature, so the temperature just above marine areas. If we look at sea level rise data sets, if we look at the amount of extent of ice in the Arctic in a given season, all of these are showing signatures of change. And they're all different data sets that are curated by different groups in different countries around the world and are all showing similar trends, not only in temperature, but other impacts. And so this observed change comes from a variety of variables as well as a variety of data sets. And if we go back in time, we'll see actually that temperature has varied quite a bit on the scale of thousands to tens of thousands and even hundreds of thousands of years. And we know this in part because we've also experienced these relatively large changes in temperature over these time periods. But these changes in temperature are oftentimes associated with ice ages. So we know that they can have a huge impact on our climate. But what's worth noting is if you look, this plot is showing you in the dark blue is the range in carbon dioxide. It's ranged from anywhere from about 180 parts per million to 280 parts per million over the last about million years. It's been somewhere within that range. And where we are today is, remember, at about 418. So we're well off this chart. So we're in an area that's been unprecedented for the last million plus years. And if you look at where we're projected to go by the end of the century, if we continue to grow our emissions as we have over the last 100 or last 50 plus years, we would be well off this chart, right? So we would be approaching 800 parts per million. And I just realized I skipped a slide, so let me go back. And so why carbon dioxide? So why is it that we're interested in this role that carbon dioxide has with temperature is that carbon dioxide is called a greenhouse gas because it has some similar properties that a greenhouse does for growing plants. In particular, carbon dioxide does not interact with the type of radiation that comes from the sun. So when you walk outside and you feel that heat on your face and on a warm day, that's because the radiation is interacting with your body. But in general, it does not interact with carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So carbon dioxide doesn't really care about solar energy when it comes in. But when that energy from the sun is absorbed by the earth or by ourselves or our buildings or our plants or the ocean, it is re-emitted. And when it's re-emitted at a different type of characteristic in which carbon dioxide happens to really like to interact with. And so what that means is that energy as it's flowing out of the Earth system is actually captured by carbon dioxide molecules and then re-emitted in every direction, keeping part of that energy back down to Earth. And so it actually acts, another way to say it is it acts like a blanket. And so as you increase the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, you're actually basically putting another layer of blanket over the Earth, which is keeping the heat in. So to recap, the average global temperature of the Earth's surface has risen and it will continue to rise because of increases in these human-caused gases such as carbon dioxide, which hold this heat close to the surface. And so we talked a little bit about carbon dioxide, but there's other gases such as methane and nitrous oxide and others that have a similar effect. And what we do know is, going back to some of these plots back here, is that what this means is that the amount of ice on Earth will actually start to shrink. In particular, the stable ice masses that have existed on land will start to melt. As a result of this melting from these large masses of ice, the sea level will start to rise, which it already has been doing. In addition, as the ocean warms itself, it expands, and so it rises for that reason as well. And inherently, if these things are changing, if the global average temperature has increased and even the local temperatures in Long Island have increased, then this means that the weather must change, because by definition, weather is a measure of our typical experience. And that means that if the average experience is changing, then the individual events themselves have to be changing. So what we explore in our group at Stony Brook is really trying to understand how will weather change and how do we project these changes. So first, let's take a second and say, well, what do we mean by extreme weather here? So for extreme weather, that occurs in a variety of ways on Earth. It occurs through tropical cyclones or hurricanes. It occurs through severe storms like you see in the lower left, or tornadoes. It can occur from extreme precipitation events, which lead to flooding, flooding can also come from severe storms and or hurricanes. It can also come in the form of extreme amounts of snow, as well as it can come in the form of heat waves and droughts, right? So this would be the lack of precipitation or a really warm period. And so these type of extreme weather events have a large impact on society that measures well into the tens of billions and not hundreds of billions every year just in the United States alone. And they often have a direct impact right on society through impacting mortality rates. They can impact public health. And oftentimes the way in which they have impacts on society is inequitable. So certain parts of the world and certain groups are impacted more by extremes than others. And so, of course, right here on Long Island, right, we're no stranger to hurricanes, and we experience them every few years in some regard, and oftentimes almost every year. It seems recently there's a potential a few days in advance that a storm might be coming near. But of course, the most obvious impact that's still a lot on our mind is coming up on 10 years ago now, Hurricane Sandy, which made landfall, of course, in New Jersey, but had impacts throughout the entire region through a combination of precipitation, high winds, as well as storm surge. And in cases, it obviously devastated aspects of the city and the coastline in New Jersey. It had huge impacts for coastal erosion throughout Long Island. And it's trying to understand not necessarily the general day-to-day weather and how it changes with climate change, but we're actually now focusing on these type of extreme events, because it's these events that really have an impact on our livelihood. Because a Hurricane Sandy is an event that we still talk about now. We're still planning to recover from it now, right? Parts of our area are still trying to build back after Hurricane Sandy. And so these are events that we focus on in part because they have such a large impact on our society, in some cases decades after their influence. But this is just one type of extreme weather event that impacts the United States, for example. And so this is just showing for 2021. So not a year in which it was particularly impactful for our region, but if you focus on the United States, you can see that there's a variety of impact from a variety of those different types of extremes. You'll notice that actually on the eastern part of the United States, that a lot of the impacts of extremes come from events that produce a lot of precipitation. And on the western United States, it often comes from events that often are associated with a lack of precipitation. So droughts, which can lead to then wildfires. These are storms that make up what are called the $1 billion weather and climate disasters. That's a database that's kept by the US government that's focused on understanding the number of events that occur every year that have over $1 billion in damage. And again, it's focused just on the United States. And so you can see there's quite a variety, but on the eastern United States, we typically focus on these events, particularly hurricanes and other severe storms that give us our most extreme events, as well as some years it's also snowstorms. But if we look at the trend in these type of events over the last approaching 50 years now, or 40 plus years, is that you see that there's actually been a large increase in the number of these billion-dollar disasters every year, a very substantial increase. It's worth noting that these are inflation-adjusted dollars, meaning that the increase isn't just due to the value of the dollar changing. And the colors represent the different types of extreme events that lead to this damage. And so the first that shows up is really the green, which is an increasing amount, right? So this is the impact of severe storms. So these are kind of your thunderstorms and tornadoes. But you'll notice the yellow is tropical storms. So every year for the last few years, there's been at least tropical storms that have had a billion-dollar disaster. And if you just go back to 2011, you can see there was actually 4 that occurred. In 2020, it was even more. And this is kind of consistent with what we'd expect from climate change, actually. It's actually, if you look at the National Climate Assessment, it states that changes in extreme weather are the primary way that most people will influence or experience climate change, and that human-induced climate change has already changed the severity and then sometimes frequency of these events. But it's also worth noting that it's not decoupled from the fact that as a society, we're making ourselves more vulnerable to these type of events, right? We're not only do we live in coastal areas that experience hurricanes, we're more of our population lives in those areas now than they did 40 years ago. And so because of that, we're making ourselves more vulnerable. The same is true for the areas that are susceptible to severe storms, such as the Midwest, which is also seeing an increase in the number of people that live in harm's way. So we'll spend a little bit of time focusing on a high level view of what scientists, what type of tools they use to investigate these, to try to understand how these events will change, not only over the last 40 years, how have they changed, but how will they change in the future. And so the main way in which we do this is through computer models, right? So similar to how people on Wall Street tried to predict the markets, not only on the scale of seconds to days, but also how they try to predict markets out for years. Climate scientists do the same thing, and they have numerical models that are, of course, imperfect tools, but they're mathematically based that simplify versions, or I guess we'll call them simplified versions of the real climate, because the climate system, if you remember way back at the beginning of the talk, the climate system is very complex. And so it's difficult to represent every single process that's important, but we try to capture a lot of the feedbacks that we know are important for the climate system. And so just an example of this is that basically what we do is we take the Earth and we split it into thousands, in some case millions of grid boxes that represent small patches of the Earth. And within those patches of the Earth, so as you kind of see zoomed out here, we try to represent the important processes that occur at those scales. So we try to account for clouds. We try to account for waves in the ocean. We try to account for the interaction of carbon, for example, between the ocean and the atmosphere, or the impact of melting waters in the mountains and things like that. So we're trying to capture all the processes that we know are important for weather and climate, and then we try to simulate them into both the historical past and into the future. And here's just an example of what this looks like. This is a simulation from that's almost 10 years old now, but that demonstrates that this is a simulation of you can think about it as the amount of water or moisture in the atmosphere, and what you can see is the complexity of Earth, right? You can see all these all the clouds that occur throughout the tropics, and you can see, for example, hurricanes that pop up and spin up in the northern latitudes. And so this is what these tools kind of look like. They're meant to be simulations of the real world and to capture a lot of those important qualities. And it's not just for things like that I was just showing for moisture. This is just an example from a NASA model that shows different types of aerosols being moved through the atmosphere. So you have aerosols that come from dust, which is kind of in orange. You have biomass aerosols, which are in green. You have these aerosols that come from the ocean, such as sea salt, that are in blue. And so you can see that the models are trying to capture the realism that you'd experience. This would be very similar to if you saw a satellite image of Earth. And so the first thing we use these climate models for is understanding the observed change, that warming that we talked about, right? So we've witnessed that the global average temperature has increased over the last 100 years, but actually the majority of that increase has occurred in about the last 50 years. And what we can do is we can run climate models, and we can, for the last, starting in 1850, and we can run them in which we increase greenhouse gases that have been observed over that time period, or don't increase greenhouse gases, keep them the same as they were in 1850, and run the model to account for other things that impact the climate system, such as volcanoes and ENSO and or El Nino, different types of variability. And what this plot on the left shows you is that if you only simulate the last 150 plus years of climate with natural variability, so not including changes in greenhouse gases, you get the green line, which doesn't show any change or a very small change in the global average temperature over the last 170 years. And that in order to reproduce that warming that we've seen, you have to include human-induced changes to the composition of the atmosphere in order to capture the warming that's been observed. And so this is just one of the ways in which climate models are used to understand that connection between carbon dioxide and the warming that we've seen, as well as our physical understanding of what carbon dioxide does and how it interacts with radiation. And another way to show that is that these models are also used to help quantify the relative impact of humans on the climate system. And you can see that the most of the warming is actually due to carbon dioxide. Another large component of the warming is due to methane and other greenhouse gases. But there are aspects of what we do to our atmosphere, such as aerosols that are also a product of electricity generation in industry, can actually act to reflect some radiation back to space, so they can actually cool. And so they offset each other to some extent, but not as much as they warm. And it's worth noting that a lot of the things that happen to offset some of the warming are things that we've actually regulated in country and in most of the developed worlds to get rid of, because they impact public health. And so this is one way in which climate models can be used. Another way in which they can be used is to make projections into the future. And so when we build projections into the future, it's kind of like looking into that looking glass and saying, well, what is a potential pathway that society can go on? And so what we do is they're really thought to be made of socioeconomic pathways. So they make assumptions about how economies will grow and change in the coming 70 or 80 years. They make assumptions about population growth, because that's a huge determinant of energy needs and food needs, which impact greenhouse gas emissions. And they make assumptions about energy transitions, that there's potential for us to shift to different types of energy, which will have a different emissions characteristic, which will impact the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And so what you see in the middle, or this kind of middle plot, that shows you the general amount of carbon emissions. So again, you'll see in the black line, the carbon emissions have increased substantially over the last 100 plus years. And that these emission scenarios try to look at, well, what happens if we continue to emit a lot, right, on the top kind of orangish line? Or what happens if we start to have a lower emissions, we start to lower emissions maybe by 2050. And the green line is kind of like, what happens if we even lower our emissions even more? If we kind of get on a pathway right now to really reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by changing our energy sources. And the ramifications is that it can produce an estimate of what the global average temperature will be like at the end of the century, which can range anywhere from about 1 degree Celsius in terms of Celsius, or roughly 2 degrees Fahrenheit, up to about 4 degrees. So that's the range. That's a range. These are made up of multi-model ensembles of over 30 individual climate models that are built from different centers around the world. And so you'll notice that the 4 degree estimate, though, in Celsius, which is approximately 7 degrees Fahrenheit increase in global average temperature, has a range associated to it. And that just means that that some of the estimates suggest that it might be closer to 10 Fahrenheit. But we use these scenarios not only to understand how our climate system will change and how the feedbacks interact, to learn more about the system, but also to potentially produce pathways to understanding what the changes and impacts of that will be. And we can use these to also project things, not just global temperature. We can project sea ice extent in the Arctic. We can project how much the sea level will rise globally. And that's also what these climate models are used for. And how do we evaluate these? So there's a variety of ways in which we evaluate climate models and future climate. One is through international body, which is called which is set up through the United Nations. It's called the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which comes out on assessment reports every kind of 7-ish years now. And then also we do this nationally, which comes out with through the National Climate Assessment, which comes out with reports almost every 5-ish years that focuses on changes and impacts in the United States. And I'm not going to talk much about this. I'm just going to show you that these are typically what comes out of things like these assessments. It can show you what the future temperature distribution would look like under a 1.5 degree or 2 degree or a 4 degree warmer world, and what that might mean for precipitation changes, which is shown on the bottom. And that's what the international effort does. And what the national effort does is it focuses on things in the United States. So it'll do the same thing. It'll say, here is for a 2 degree versus a 4 degree warmer world. Here's what we'd expect by mid-century, by the end of the century. So by 2050 versus 2100. And here's how we expect precipitation to change. So in the Northeast, it's projected that we'll see an additional about 22% increase in precipitation in a 4 degree warmer world by the end of the century. So in 70 or 80 years. And then these reports also really give a lot of high-level details of how we'd expect extreme weather to change. And so anywhere you see a purple line, that suggests that there'll be an increase in the number of areas on the globe that are impacted by a mean temperature increase, of course, in a warmer world. This bar all the way on the left is high. But there's also things in here that's related to changes in tropical cyclones, changes in dust storms, changes in fire weather. Most of them we expect to see increases, except for in some cases where we see decreases in things like frost events or cold spells, which are another form of extreme weather. So I'm going to just finish with giving 2 examples of how we kind of take this information of decades of scientists that have worked on building climate models and how we use them at Stony Brook to try to project changes in local weather here on Long Island and the Eastern United States. And so we're going to focus on tropical cyclones because we don't, if I had another hour, I would show you some other stuff, but we'll focus on hurricanes because that's a particular focus of our group, but also because I think it's relevant for Long Island. And so what we do is we take one of these climate models, and I'm going to refer to this as a traditional approach. So we take a climate model, and so we, remember a climate model is just that numerical representation of Earth. It breaks it up into all these boxes. It tries to capture a lot of important processes in there. And what we do is that we push the bounds of what the climate model can do. So we take it from the conventional model, which if you run a conventional climate model that's run in those assessments that I was just showing you, it breaks the world into 100 kilometer by 100 kilometer boxes. So this is really big, right? So there maybe Long Island is represented in probably 2.5 boxes. And if you do that and you try to look for tropical cyclones and try to look for hurricanes globally in a almost 26-year data set, you will find this number of storms. You can almost hand count them. They have really weird tracks. They're going north and south. So this suggests that models aren't necessarily that great at simulating tropical cyclones. However, what we do in our group is we focus on pushing the bounds to the next level. So we say, can we take a climate model and can we run it at higher resolution? Well, what does that mean? Can we create more boxes? And by more boxes, it's actually, can we create 16 times or 30 times the amount of boxes? So that's where we go from thousands to millions. And we try to say, one of the first things we do is we look to see how many tropical cyclones can the model capture then. And so this is it. It's the same simulation. The only difference is the resolution. And what you can see is that you get a bunch of storms. And if you look at their tracks, it starts to look very similar to what we think. You have storms in the North Atlantic that form off the coast of Africa, and they traverse across the Atlantic until they oftentimes curve and come up near us. And if you compare that to observations, right, there's some good things that the model is doing. Now, it's not perfect. Remember, these are imperfect tools. And this was actually some work that we did over 8 years ago now. And we've advanced it since, but I thought that these plots really highlight the advantage of the tools that we use. And so what do we do with these simulations? Well, the first thing we do is we say, how does global tropical storms change in a warmer world? So what we do is we then take that that same model that I showed you that has all those tracks, and then we run it into the future. And we're going to run the high emission scenario, the one that produces a near an 8-degree Fahrenheit warming by the end of the century. And we're going to say at the end of the century, the last 30 years of a century, how did the number of storms change globally? And so if you just focus on this plot to the left, and the plot on the left and all the way on the left here in blue shows you the number of tropical cyclones that occur in the simulation. And so what it tells you is there's about 80 tropical cyclones globally every year. In the real world, from observations, is about 90. That's what the black box shows you. So the model doesn't produce quite as much as the real world, but it produces a significant amount. And if you focus on what the number of storms in the future in the red box, you'll notice that it goes down. It goes down pretty substantially, almost by roughly 20%. So we see a decrease in the number of tropical cyclones in the future. If you focus on hurricane strength, which is the middle group of storms, you'll see that the model does a really good job at capturing about the number of hurricanes that are observed every year on the globe. And if you look into the future, there's a slight decrease. But what's interesting is if you focus on the major storms, these are the ones that are category 3, 4, 5, the big ones that make impacts, we actually see a significant increase in the future. And this is just one study, and there's been a variety of groups that have kind of seen this, which is ultimately we see a decrease in the number of hurricanes in the future, but we see an increase in the most extreme ones. And so what we do in our group is we actually focus on exploring, well, what does that mean for coastal communities? So here's another way to put it. So here, I'm going to show you 3 plots like this. The top row is what we call the reference climate. So that's a simulation of the last, let's say, 30 years of historical climate. So that's what the model projects should have happened over the last 30 years. The middle row says what happens in the middle of the scenario warming. So let's say the Earth is about 2.5, 3 degrees warmer by the end of the century, degrees Celsius. And the bottom one is what happens if the Earth is 4 degrees or 4 to 5 degrees warmer by the end of the century, or approaching that 8 degrees Fahrenheit is the other way to say it. So it's really just a middle of the road versus a high continued emissions for many decades, putting more and more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And so the first thing you'll notice is this plot is showing you is, if it's called track density. Another way to say it, it's just the number of storm hours per year. So how many hours is an individual location experiencing a tropical cyclone? And so what you see is that, as you expect it in the upper, the reference climate, we see that places like Florida experience a lot of storms. Places like the Carolinas that kind of jet out just a little bit into the ocean kind of experience roughly about 2 days, right? 48 hours worth of storm experience on a given year. Some years they get multiple storms that impact them. Some years they don't get any, but it comes out to about 2 days. And the same is actually true for us up in Long Island. It's hard to see here, but it's in about the yellow. So it's about a day and a half. So that means on average, a storm comes near us about a day and a half worth every year. And what you see is that if you go down in warming, you'll see that the amount of storm hours actually decreases. So this is consistent with that plot we saw globally. The number of storms are decreasing. So the amount of impact hours that we get from storms is also decreasing. If we focus on rainfall, so now this is the amount of rainfall on average per year from hurricanes. If we focus on the rainfall, you'll notice a slightly different trend, right? Especially just focus on the upper, the historical climate. What we see is now the most rainfall occurs in Florida. And that's probably not surprising, right? So Florida gets hit with a lot of storms. And when they hit Florida, they sometimes are moving slowly, or they traverse the entire panhandle, or peninsula. And if you focus up by us, we don't actually get that much rainfall. We maybe get 6 inches of rain per year from a storm. And so this just shows you that just the track density, right, those number of hours per year, isn't a good measure of the impact from the storms, because when storms come through here, they're often moving very fast, right, because they're undergoing transition and they're going back out to the ocean. And so what you see here is it's a mixed signal, right? So if you go on to the future, we actually see, okay, in the middle of the road, maybe there's a decrease in the amount of rainfall from storms. If you go to the high emission scenario, the worst case you can call it, at the end of the century, maybe there's an increase in some areas, but maybe it's also decreasing. But you have to remember that the amount of rainfall is heavily impacted by the amount of hours of impact of a storm, right? So if we have less storms, then we'd probably expect less rainfall. But what gets really interesting is when we focus on the amount of rainfall per hour in impact. So how much rain is falling every time there's a storm making landfall. And this is where it gets really clear, right? The impact of climate change for our coastlines comes very clear. What we see is that there's a large increase through most of the Gulf Coast on the amount of rainfall per hour of impact. And so this suggests that while the storms might be decreasing in frequency, the intensity of the storm and the amount of rainfall we get from them is increasing substantially. And this is just one study, but it's consistent with a global assessment report that came out, which is shown. It's hard to see here, but it's shown that we actually project that in the future, we'll see a decrease in almost every ocean basin in TC frequency. But we'll see an increase in their intensity from a wind speed, right? That like what the Weather Channel typically reports during an event, right? The winds that are standing out there reporting on it. And the largest signal projected through a variety of studies is about a 14% increase in storm average rainfall in the future. And that's true globally, but it's true in every single basin. So this work that we're doing with kind of these new advances is also kind of being confirmed by other groups around the world. And so I want to finish with one last approach that we do, which is kind of really merging the blend between weather and climate. And so what we do here is instead of doing the traditional approach, which is running climate simulations for decades, like we just showed, and looking at average changes per year, we actually focus on an event of interest. We do a storyline approach. So we use the same model, we use the climate model, but now we turn it into a weather model. So instead of simulating for decades, we're going to simulate for just 7 days. We're going to do the same exact thing that the Weather Service does when they produces that information that goes into your favorite app, or if you watch the Weather Channel or you look at the newspaper to see what the weather is going to be like this weekend. It comes from a weather model that's run for 7 days by the National Weather Service. We do the same thing, except we just do it with our climate model, the same model that was used to do the decadal trends. And we initialize the model at times in advance of storms. And then we run what we call a counterfactual simulation. This is what we initialize for the same storm, but instead of simulated in today's conditions, we simulate it in what the conditions were in 1850, because we have all of these climate simulations from back here that we can use to tell us what the climate was like, what the climate was like in the 1850. And we can remove that climate signal to date that's due to increases in greenhouse gas emissions, and we can rerun our simulations. So essentially we have two sets of simulations. We have a forecast, and then we have a counterfactual forecast in which the large scale change due to climate in things like temperature and humidity and sea surface pressure are removed. And so what it allows us is we look at a storm like Hurricane Florence. This is just an example. Hurricane Florence made landfall in the Carolinas in 2018, and in some places dumped almost 3 feet of rain. And so if we simulate the same event in our model, it shows up in red. So we can actually get in the dark black line as the observations, and we can actually produce this, the location of landfall quite well, similar to what other operational centers were doing at the time. We're not an operational center, we're just running this. So we're able to kind of reproduce some of the same results. And then the blue line shows what happens in a world without climate change. So you'll say there's not much difference. Well, and that's perfect, because what we want to do is we want to compare the rainfall. And so the fact that the tracks are very similar means that we can go now compare the characteristics of the storm to see how it's changed. So what we can do is we can make plots like this. So the plot on the left is the observed rainfall from Hurricane Florence, which dumped in some areas over 30 inches, right? So almost 3 feet of rainfall. And the middle plot shows our actual forecast. So this is what our model forecasts for the region. It also can produce rain rates or rain amounts that are over almost 3 feet. So it can produce the same magnitude that was observed. Now, like any simulation that's done multiple days before the storm makes landfall, you'll notice that the rain field pattern isn't perfectly match observations. We wouldn't expect it to do because this is multiple days before it makes landfall, but also the middle is an ensemble. So it's actually 20 different, actually in this case, it's 98 individual simulations of that storm that are averaged together to calculate this plot. Where observations only has one reality, it has one what we call ensemble. And the right is actually the counterfactual. So this is that simulation without climate change. And just by eyeballing this, you can see it doesn't actually produce rates that are much larger than 2 feet of accumulation. And if we actually calculate the most extreme changes by using all of it, we actually see that there's about a 5% increase in the amount of extreme rainfall due to climate change that can be attributed to human-induced climate change for Hurricane Florence. And so some of the work that we're doing to try to generalize this so we can start to look at, well, what does this mean for areas like Long Island, is we can look at the 2020 season. So the 2020 hurricane season had over 30 storms in the Atlantic Basin. And we can say, instead of running this for an individual storm like Hurricane Florence, what we do is we actually initialize these actual and counterfactual forecasts every 3 days throughout the entire hurricane season. We removed the large scale signal to date, which has been actually about 1 degree Celsius. So the Earth has warmed by 1 degree Celsius due to human increase in greenhouse gases. That's resulted in about a 0.4 to 0.6, so roughly 1 degree Fahrenheit increase in the sea surface temperature in the Atlantic Ocean. And what we can do is we can say, well, what happens if we run our actual and counterfactuals for an entire season? So this just shows you the precipitation, or sorry, the tracks for the simulations for the actual and counterfactual and the rainfall that came from hurricanes during the 2020 season. So there's not much you can gauge from that. But if you focus on a plot like this, which takes all of the information from that previous plot, and it says, what are the amount of the likelihood of 3 hourly rain rates? So what this plot on the right shows you is it shows you that the most extreme rain rates that were simulated in the season are the red line, and the blue lines are for the counterfactual. And what's hard, it's a little hard to see here, but it's actually shifted, right? So the red distribution is shifted towards higher rainfall rates. So what it means is that the 2020 season saw about a 10% increase in stream rainfall amounts due to climate change, including those that made impact or impacted our region. And that increase, another way to say that is the extremity of the hurricane season became wetter. The season itself became wetter by about 10% because of human-induced climate change. So I just want to finish, right? So this has kind of been a whirlwind. We talked a little bit about what climate change is. We talked a little bit about how we define extreme weather events and why they have impacts. And then I gave you 2 flavors of how we use tools within our group. But I want to kind of summarize the whole thing as not just talking about the 2 events that we showed or the 2 examples that I showed, but to highlight that extremes are a natural component of a stable climate. So even in a world without climate change, we have extreme events. But in a world in which that energy balance we talked about at the very beginning is starting to become unbalanced, right? In a world in which we've turned up the faucet in our bathtub, but kept the drain amount at the same, right? The balance on our Earth is becoming, there's no longer an imbalance. So therefore the climate is changing and therefore extremes are changing. And so there's a variety of ways in which we project that extremes will change beyond just what I talked about today. More frequent heat waves, more frequent droughts, hotter and more frequent days and nights, fewer cold days and nights, more intense precipitation. And we saw that for the 2020 season. It was about a 5 to 10% increase, depending upon the metric, and more intense hurricanes. And this has direct implications for us on Long Island. And so I just want to finish real quick with just, of course, acknowledging that I didn't do this work by myself, that this was work that I did with the students and researchers in my group, which are shown here. So a thank you to them for all the work that they've done. And then I just want to quickly acknowledge that while I just showed you a little bit about hurricanes, we also focus on trying to understand how precipitation in frontal systems change, how precipitation in extratropical cyclones change. And so this is just one example of focusing on cyclones here, and just quickly acknowledge all the sources that fund me and all the links that I used for the presentation. So thank you. So we have time maybe for a few questions, and I'll try to check if anybody raises their hand virtually, I'll see it. So we'll go over here first. Yeah.
Would you mind going back a slide?
Yep.
So The counterfactual, that's like, without the effects of today's climate change.
Correct.
That's just like natural increase. If it, like,
Yeah, so what it is it's actually what the temperature would have looked like if the conditions in terms of greenhouse gases were what they were in 1850.
okay, so there is supposed to be like a natural increase, it's just heightened now because of our.
Well, actually, what if we go back to here a while back? It's a good question. If we go back to this plot, if you actually look at the change that's occurred in the natural simulation over these years, what we're doing is we're basically comparing this case to this case.
Oh,
And so in
okay,
this
so
case,
it's
there
that
actually hasn't been an increase. Now, there's been some variability because certain seasons are an El Nino or a La Nina, which can impact global temperature. But what we've removed is essentially this difference between these two simulations.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
Yep. Yeah, in the back.
You mentioned, the differences between carbon dioxide and oxygen and nitrogen. I didn't really hear, I don't know, is it some of that based on like the coefficient of thermal conductivity for carbon dioxide as compared to
Yeah.
oxygen and nitrogen?
Yeah, so for the different types of greenhouse gases, so we focus on carbon dioxide in part because it actually lasts in the atmosphere longer. So it can last for over 200, in some cases 300 years. And so when we emit carbon dioxide now, we're committing ourselves to greenhouse gas, an actual warming to some extent for 100 years, where other types of greenhouse gases are much shorter lived. So something like methane is much shorter lived in the atmosphere. So even though it's actually also increasing, if we were to shut that off, it wouldn't actually have as much of an impact because the amount of methane would go down pretty quickly, where carbon dioxide would actually still continue to increase the global temperature, even if we stopped emitting all emissions today. So that's why we focus on that. And it's in part because of it's how long it can stay in the atmosphere.
But not its conductivity?
No, so it's in part because it's not the thermal conductivity. It's because of the other aspect is because of where carbon dioxide absorbs radiation happens to be at the peak of where Earth emits radiation. So this is another reason why we focus on carbon dioxide, because it particularly likes the wavelengths of radiation in which Earth emits. And so it's right in the middle of it, as opposed to methane and water. Water vapor is also a greenhouse gas, but it also happens to absorb at different lengths, wavelengths, different types of radiation. Chris? Oh.
How about mechanism on hurricanes? For a long time,
Mm-hmm.
you hear people saying news, warmer oceans fuel stronger hurricanes. So, and it sounds like maybe that is what you're seeing, warmer oceans,
Yep.
stronger hurricanes. But how about the fewer hurricanes? What's the mechanism there?
Yeah, so
And if I'm wrong on the stronger hurricanes.
yeah, so you're right. So if we just go back to the 2020 case, right, this increase in rainfall that we see, it is directly linked to the ocean warming. So the changes that we do is we update the thermodynamics. We remove the climate change signal from a thermodynamic point. So it's actually coming directly from that. So the hurricanes get their energy from the ocean surface. And the warmer the ocean, the more energy they can get, which means the stronger they can become and the more rainfall they can have. In terms of what controls the global decrease. So this is an active area of understanding. So I would say about 10 years ago, the consensus was that it was decreasing, and actually more recently, it's coming that we're actually more unsure than we were. And there's two potential competing effects. So the first is that we expect environments to become more conducive to tropical cyclogenesis, to storms forming, because they are warmer and they're more moist, and those are things that are needed. But there's other aspects that impact whether a cyclone can develop, and that is changes in the wind with height in the atmosphere. So wind shear is what it's called. If that's changing, that can actually inhibit growth, even though the surface temperature might be warm. And one of the things that impacts shear is the stability. So actually, one of the things that we do know is that as the Earth warms, the atmosphere actually inherently becomes more stable, meaning it's harder for motions to go up and down in the atmosphere. And that's important for a hurricane, because that's what a hurricane is. It's actually taking a bunch of energy from the surface, a bunch of air, and moving it up in its core. And so one thought is that the atmosphere, because it's becoming more stable, is making it harder for storms to form. But when they do, they can come really strong because the environment's more conducive from an energy perspective. So that is one of the working hypothesis of why the storms might be decreasing and why we see this increase in the most extreme ones. So we see a kind of a shift, right, to more likelihood of it being extreme once they do form. But the one that's actually becoming more out and more recently is related to the precursor events that lead to storms. So storms just don't happen. They come from a variety of different disturbances in the atmosphere. So in the North Atlantic, actually 80% of the storms come from what are called African easterly waves. So these are just disturbances that come off the coast of Africa. If you watch a satellite image, you just see kind of clumps of, especially during the summer season, you'll see clumps of clouds come off of Africa almost regularly, every 2 to 3 days. And there's a question to understanding, even though the environment might be more conducive, is the frequency of those precursors changing? And so this is an active area because it kind of becomes two things. It's the likelihood of a precursor becoming a storm versus the frequency of the precursor itself. And when we started to look at various climate models in that perspective, it gets a little bit murky. So the models that do project a large decrease in the future, it's actually because those precursor events are decreasing. And the models that project maybe the numbers to be around the same, which is not what our model that I showed here does, they actually, it's because those precursors stay about the same. And so it's not actually the environment necessarily, it's kind of the precursors to it. So that's an area of active research, but that's really, that's the important question, of course. But what I think is, I'll just add to that real quick though, is a lot of focus gets put on a frequency. And I actually think that the frequency is not that important, because if you look at a place like Long Island, we get hit with a particularly damaging storm pretty rarely, right? And so whether that happens once every, I don't know what the exact return is, but if that happens once in every 30 years versus once in every 25 years, which is like the level of change that we're seeing, doesn't necessarily matter much from the standpoint of what we do know is that when we do get hit, that it for sure is likely to be stronger. And so whether that the frequency changes by a few years in terms of return values, it's really focusing on how the characteristics of the storm has changed, which is more important from an adaptation and planning standpoint. So let me see if there's any. Okay, there's our one question in the chat. So it says, yeah, okay, this is a good question. So Julia asked, how will increased rainfall in the Northeast affect biodiversity? Not humans, but how will it affect our ecosystems? And so that's an important thing because it's an active area of research. So I don't know the answer to that question specifically, but I can say that particularly in the Northeast, which is heavily urbanized, like where we live, that when you have increases in rainfall, that means that everything that we have on the ground, whether it's pesticides for agriculture, whether it's just pollutants in the city, when we have extreme rainfall amounts, that actually runs off into our ecosystems. And so changes in rainfall from a kind of health standpoint can actually really directly impact them and actually maybe decrease some of the biodiversity potentially through kind of the polluted runoff. But it can also impact, right, a lot of our ecosystems are really focused, are delicate balances between freshwater and saltwater, and having this freshwater input that comes in very quickly can also impact ecosystems as well. Yeah, and so Bridget said, Long Island's best hope is better runoff drainage. So that's also, right, so I guess it's kind of contradictory. Of course, that would also be needed. But I would say not only better runoff, but smarter runoff drainage. So building systems that can use natural solutions, such as having the water, not just get it through stormwater drainages quickly to somewhere, because that actually leads to flash flooding, but having it ways in which it can be smartly, filtered into the groundwater as well as other ways is going to be pretty important. So I think you're right. Is there any, maybe one more? Yeah.
Yeah, on slide 43, I was looking at the maps.
Mm-hmm.
Specifically on Florida and Central Florida, why does Central Florida get hit with less rain than the surrounding area? So is that because of the coast and stuff, and it kind of has that body of protection?
Yeah, so well, most of the rainfall in a storm, and this is why these maps are a little blotchy, because even though these are simulations of 30 years, and there is 3 ensemble members, so it's actually 90 years worth of storms, where you see the highest rain rates will be oftentimes right where the storm comes online or comes on shore, because that's where it gets this extra level of uplift, which is one of the ways in which rain's formed. And so you'll get the extreme rainfall will often occur right near the coast. But also as they start to move inland, they lose the moisture source. So they're raining out the moisture, and because they're not over the ocean, they're not collecting more moisture to rain. So that is why we kind of see oftentimes this general characteristic. The fact that there's like this bullseye right here is maybe what you're referring to. That's probably just a little bit of randomness.
Right, okay.
Yeah. So we could run, if we ran another set of simulations, added a couple more ensemble members, you'd probably start to see something like this go away, and it would become a little bit more smoother. But that's one of the biggest trade-offs we have with these type of simulations, because as we go to this high resolution, right, these simulations become roughly about 30 times more expensive than in terms of computational costs. So to run these type of simulations often takes a supercomputer. We run on tens of thousands of computers for days and sometimes weeks. And so we're limited right now by the number of ensembles. And that's one of the advantages of switching to the storyline approach, is that for those Florence runs, for example, we're able to run 100 ensembles because they're only 7 days long versus 30 years. But as we go, as computers continually become faster and more energy efficient, more groups are starting to run more and more ensembles, and that would start to understand, whether these little artifacts are real or whether they're kind of just a little bit of the randomness that occurs.
If you don't mind me asking, how much money of the funding goes to running this ensemble?
Yeah, so a lot of our group's funding comes from the Department of Energy, and that's in part because the Department of Energy is very interested in knowing where water is going to be in the future, because every conventional form of energy depends upon water. And it also so happens that the Department of Energy has some of the world's, or at least the nation's fastest supercomputers. And so I don't know the exact breakdown, because what happens when you're funded by the Department of Energy is you then can write a separate proposal to get computational time. It doesn't come necessarily on the budget for doing the analysis aspect. So, but that would be, there are some people out there that have done a couple studies that have focused on trying to understand what is, full disclosure, the carbon impact, emissions impact of running large climate simulations.
Like Bitcoin mining is massive.
Yeah, exactly. And oftentimes using fossil fuels, right? So that's a great concern. And some of the modeling centers have actually moved now to be to areas where they're not using coal plants, but they're using natural gas, which does reduce the emissions intensity a little bit. But ultimately, I don't know the answer to that question, but I think it's a good one.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for the questions, and feel free to reach out if you have any other questions. Thank you for coming.